The Gospel of the Lord. In the longer version of this Gospel, Jesus and the Samaritan woman have an exchange where he knows the suffering in her life. And she says she's had 5 husbands. Now, in the ancient world, a woman couldn't just seek divorce. It had to be, as it sadly is in still some parts of the world, had to be the man's initiative. So whatever had happened in her life, there'd been a lot of suffering, a lot of grief. And Jesus knows it because he's attending to her so profoundly, so intently in this spiritual conversation. And the Samaritans and the Jews from the outside look pretty close in their beliefs. I suppose it'd be like a Jew or an Islamist looking at Catholics and Protestants and saying, well, what's the difference? But of course, the closer you are to each other, sometimes the more intense the difficulties and differences become. Freud wrote about that. He called it the narcissism of small differences. We're more irritated by small differences with our neighbour than bigger ones. But anyway, the reality is this was a very transgressive act by Jesus to talk to this woman at all. She doesn't have a male relative present in the middle of the day at the well. He's a rabbi. The conversation shouldn't be happening. But as we know, time and time again, especially in his outreach to those who were marginalised, and in many cases women in the Gospels, he is deliberately bold and fearless about transgressing the rules, and of course he'll pay for his life with it later in the Gospel. But here he is, without fear, in a deep exchange with this woman about the meaning of life. From whence comes the living water that quenches the thirst that we all have? And there's the wonderful line from Jesus, you worship what you do not know. How many of us at times, and those we know who don't have the gift of faith, still worship what they do not know, still perform rituals, liturgies, whatever it might be, of shopping or other things, that are really about searching for that infinite horizon, whether it's named or not, because the human heart is always craving more than the world can ever give, more love, more peace, more joy than the world can give. This desire of the heart, the restlessness of the human heart, is everywhere. And in this wonderful exchange, though, we're reminded again of the style of Jesus Christ, always creating space for the other person, especially the poor or excluded. Always, even though he never had a home, creating a home of the Spirit in these conversations, in these exchanges, which are full of respect and love and attention to the actual individual, not an abstraction, not a principle, not a theological tract, the actual person, the flesh and blood before him. And he's present. Arvo Part says somewhere that music arises from the silence between the notes. And what we don't get from the word, as beautiful as it is the embodied silence of this exchange. And in those silences, Jesus is listening. And the Samaritan woman is listening. This is a real exchange, spiritual, grounded, not a debate, not a superficial, how are you, but something so profound that we recall it 2,000 years later together today. But in the silences of our exchanges with people, that's where we truly listen. With the Spirit, though, we can call down the Spirit. The Archbishop has a letter up the back announcing that we're holding a synod in the Archdiocese of Sydney. And this, of course, comes from Pope Francis's impetus and request that the church be more synodal. And if you're not sure what that means, You're not alone, in a sense. Everyone's busy with their lives. But Pope Francis is trying to push this idea of a listening church, of a church really that would reflect the tone, the style, the exchange of this gospel today, of deep listening that releases the Spirit to be present in the conversation, that sees the church become a place of these profound exchanges, of loving listening, with the possibility that I might not have all the answers. So it's not a debating club we're enjoining today. The Eucharist doesn't give us palm cards to conquer other people's illogic. It gives us a way of being, a whole way of life, flesh and blood, that is hopefully open by God's grace to God's grace. In my own life, then, if we want a synodal church that is reaching out like Christ to those on the edge, those outside our comfort zone, outside, in this case, the tribes of Judah, to the Samaritan, that capacity to constantly reach out is its own gift of the Spirit, but it requires me to be fearless like our Lord, to be bold, to make time to really and truly listen, for which I require the listening of my own heart. I need to enter into the silence between the notes in my own relationship with the Lord, but never complacent, but so that I can have the strength to talk to those with whom I may have, I feel, nothing in common, or those with whom I disagree strongly. But to hold open the door the way Christ does for an exchange of love and respect and the possibility of shifting. The greatest sign of spiritual illness is rigidity of heart, the suppleness of the Spirit that the Lord reveals here in this conversation. It doesn't mean when she asks, where's the living water, that, oh, I don't know. He knows exactly. He is the living water. But that doesn't mean he can't listen to her story of her search. Of course, she goes away from this profound spiritual conversation full of the Spirit. She now becomes a prophetess to her own people. So the fruit of our exchange in a synodal church is always going to be the joy that she experiences, the peace of knowing and loving Jesus Christ. That's how we'll know whether our conversations are more than just, God forbid, culture wars or some sort of debating club, and have moved into something profoundly and truly spiritual, where the church can be led by the Spirit to continue growing and developing. So this is the challenge of this wonderful exchange. In our own lives, to try to imitate, as his disciples, the style of the Master. To pause, to listen to people in my life perhaps I've given up on, I don't want to speak to, in a workplace, a family, a neighbourhood. To remember again, with the Spirit's grace, this other person is the alter Christus, the other Christ. They could be my teacher, but only if I'm prepared to step beyond and to really engage, to live that way. But we can't do it on our own, in our frailty. We call down the Spirit to give us the strength to hold open our hearts to others.